Let's open our Bibles tonight to the book of John. Book of John, chapter 4. I am not going to read all 29 verses, but we will be using many of them throughout the message. But to begin with, I'm only going to read verses 1 through 7. When therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again unto Galilee. And he must needs go through Samaria. I'll come back to that verse, but just let that soak in for right now. Then cometh he to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being weary with his journey, sat thus on the well. And it was about the 6th hour, or about 12 noon, our time. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. The story of the woman at the well is interesting for so many different reasons. In verse 4, it said Jesus must go through Samaria. The question for me is very simple. Why must he go through Samaria? That was contradictory to everything the Jews did. Here's Jerusalem. Here's where Jesus is going. The Jews they hated the Samaritans. They despised the Samaritans. They couldn't stand the Samaritans. So when they would come, they would cross over the Jordan River, go up the east side to avoid Samaria, and then when they got past Samaria, they would cross back over the Jordan River to where they were going. But in this case, Jesus must go through Samaria. Now, if this were a quiz, I would be really interested to read your answers on why he must go through Samaria. It contradicted everything that Jews stood for. It was against every principle that the Jewish people, just totally did not want anything to do with the Samaritans. So why must he go through Samaria? I'll give you a hint. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. You hear that verse all the time. Very few people put the rest of that chapter with that verse. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. How shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? You can't call on the Lord until you have believed. Belief comes before calling on the Lord. I use the analogy, when does a baby cry? Before it's born or after it's born? Y'all know the answer to that one? I remember well the day I was born. I remember every detail of it, mostly because they told me a few things. But when a baby is born, if the baby doesn't cry naturally, they will slap it or do something to get the baby to cry as evidence of life. Not in order to become alive, but as evidence that they are alive. So too, when does a baby, let me go back to that verse I was quoting. How shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? How shall they believe on him in whom they have not heard? They must hear before they can believe. Then once they believe, they call on the Lord and God saves them. They don't call to be saved. They call as evidence that they are saved. That destroys the whole idea of, here, call on the Lord and repeat this prayer. Destroys it, because they can't call on him in whom they have not already believed. You hear, you believe, then you call on the Lord. But I digress. He must go through, because one of his sheep are there, and that sheep needs to hear the gospel. Years ago, I got into a debate. I was young, pastoring my first church, fresh out of college. We needed some legal work done. So I heard about this lawyer. He's a great Christian lawyer. He's a Baptist preacher. So I went to his office, and he found out I was a Baptist pastor. And so we began discussing. Now, I won't use the theological term because I don't want to confuse you, but he told me flat out that if a person was elected, they would be saved even if they never heard the gospel. The gospel was unnecessary. They did not need to hear the gospel. If they were elected, they were saved whether they ever heard the gospel or not. Well, we had a nice discussion. Why did Jesus must go through Samaria? The lady at the well had to hear the gospel before she could be saved. That's why Jesus said to the church, go you into all the world and preach the gospel. Preach the gospel. That was in Mark. In Matthew, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Go ye therefore and make disciples. Paul said we make disciples in Romans. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. For it, the gospel, is the power of God unto salvation. So they must hear the gospel before they will ever be saved. That's our responsibility. That's why he must needs go through. So the woman at the well had to hear the gospel. In verse 6, how is it that Jesus got tired? They had traveled, from Judea and departed into Galilee. The 12 apostles had traveled the same distance. The 12 apostles did not get tired. The 12 apostles went on down into town to buy food so that when they came back, they all could eat, including Jesus. So why was it that Jesus grew weary in his journey? I'm hoping you're thinking. I don't want to just ask questions for the sake of asking questions. The apostles weren't tired. So how is it that Jesus became weary right at the very well where the woman was going to come to draw water? I will come back to this, maybe. It's in my notes anyway. Have you ever found your plans not going as planned? You know, something happens and your plans get changed. Instead of going where you were planning, you end up on the back of a tow truck sitting in a garage for several hours. What are you going to do? This wasn't in my schedule. I don't have time for this. How soon can you get my car fixed? I got to get out of here. I got places to go. Maybe God put you in that garage because there's a Samaritan woman coming through that God put you there to present the gospel to her. See, that changes your whole perspective, doesn't it? Instead of saying, I don't know why my car died, it's like, oh, my car died. That means I'm going to meet somebody that I'm going to get to witness to. After all, you're sitting in the lounge. You're sitting there. They're sitting there. They can't go anywhere because their car's broke down. So you've got them for 30 minutes, an hour. You've got them. They can't do anything. It's a great opportunity, instead of griping and grumbling, to say, Lord, help me to find the woman at the well. So he became weary. Now, I'm not going to get into how God could be weary, but he was weary in the flesh, not the Godhead. He was weary in the flesh. But he became weary, and he sat on the well, so that there's no way the woman at the well could possibly miss him. And there's no way that he could possibly miss her. Now, some of these would be great discussions, and we could fill an hour with some of these discussions. But that's not what I want to focus on. I want to focus on Jesus as he witnessed to her. I don't know how to witness. Well, we'll give you one way to approach it. And then particularly, I want to notice her responses to the witness of Jesus. Because how she responded is how many lost people respond today. Then we will see just how Jesus kept bringing her back to the main point. And if you've ever witnessed to somebody, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, I've got my first point covers all the way down through verse 26. So we're going to go through this somewhat quickly. At least that's my plan. Notice in verse 7. There cometh the woman of Samaria to draw water. And Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. You know, Jesus often used illustrations. He would talk about sheep, and every shepherd could identify it. He would talk about wheat, and every farmer could identify it. He talked about subjects that they knew to break the ice and to get started into a conversation. First church I pastored, we had a gentleman, God saved him while I was there. And he was one of those guys that was on fire to tell everybody what God had done, how God had saved him. He wanted to tell everybody. But he lacked this little thing called tact. And I don't mean you sit on a tack and go, ouch. He would go out, see somebody that he thought was lost. He would walk right up to them, get right in front of their face, and say, "You're going to hell." Needless to say, not many people listened to him beyond that point. They turned him off faster than a speeding bullet. Walk up to total strangers, get in their face, and yell at them, "You're going to hell." Couldn't understand why people didn't want to listen to him. Jesus began talking about something the lady could identify with. You're drawing water. How about giving me a drink? If I were talking to a farmer, it's like, how your crops going this year? Do you ever think what's going to happen to your crops when you die? You break the ice. How about giving me some water? He doesn't tell her she's going to hell. He doesn't tell her, repeat after me. He doesn't tell her, you need to be saved, lady. He just starts the conversation. Hey, how about giving me some water? The woman said in verse 9, let me back up. She didn't understand what he was talking about spiritually. She said in verse 9, "How is it that thou, being a Jew, asketh water of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans." In other words, all she can think is earthly. Jesus ultimately is going to talk about living water. But she can't understand that. She can't grasp spiritual things. She doesn't understand spiritual things. And so when Jesus is talking about water, the only water she understands is literal, physical H2O water. She has no concept of spiritual things. Don't be surprised when lost people don't know what you're talking about. When I used to do death notifications, that was a large part of my job at the hospital in Texas, and also when I moved up here with the police, my job was to go to the family and say, "I'm sorry to inform you." Well, there were some things I had to do. I had to make sure I had the right person. I was at the right house, talking to the right member of the family. There were several things we had to do first. But then it's like, I hate to tell you, but your husband was killed in a car wreck. They told us, never say your husband is gone. You know why? How many of you know why you don't say your husband is gone? Well, where's he gone? Cincinnati? You know, where's he gone? He's dead. Your husband passed. Where did he pass? Where did you pass him? No. Your husband is dead. He's gone. He's dead. And I mean, you had to be very explicit because some people just don't get it. In the spiritual realm, where would you go if you died right now? The answer I get most frequently is, well, I hope I go to heaven. You talk about spiritual things, lost people just like this lady. The only water she knew anything about was literal H2O that came out of the well, that you bathed with, you brushed your teeth with, you drunk and made your and drunk with your meals. That's all she understood. In verse 9, instead of, I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea what you're talking about. But let me ask you about the Jew and the Samaritan relationship. How is it that you, being a Jew, are talking to me, a Samaritan, because the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans? Let's get off of the subject and talk about something else. I don't understand this water business. So let me ask you a religious question. Or actually, it was a societal question. I don't understand, so I'm going to change the subject. Notice in verse 10, Jesus tries to explain that he's talking about living water. You know, Jesus answered and said unto her, if thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, give me to drink, thou wouldest have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. Jesus comes back to spiritual things. Let's not get sidetracked over here with the Jews and the Samaritans and their hate for each other. Let's get back to the main focus. I'm talking about living water, not that water down in the well. In verse 11, the woman said, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? She doesn't get it. She doesn't understand. How are you going to get this living water out of a well that's very deep when you don't even have a bucket to draw up with? You know, it kind of reminded me of Nicodemus when Jesus said in John chapter 3, you must be born again. Nicodemus said, how can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter the second time into his mother's womb and be born again? He did not understand. And so in his mind, being born again meant he had to somehow go back through the physical birth process, and Nicodemus couldn't get it. He didn't understand how that the Holy Spirit is compared to the wind. He didn't get it. He didn't understand. Don't get mad at lost people who don't or can't understand spiritual things. I heard a good friend of mine, I heard him many times. We don't get mad at blind people for being blind. We feel sorry for them. Lost people are dead. Have you ever been to a funeral? And the body's lying there in the casket. Friends and family are walking by. And as you walk by, you look at that body that used to be a person. And you say, I got one last question for you before we bury you. Yeah, you're exactly right. No, they're dead. You don't expect them to answer. You don't expect them. Now, I'm going to tell you one more time how to overhaul an engine. They're dead. They don't get it. They will never get it. Something has to happen to them before they are capable of understanding what you're trying to say. Lost people are just as dead as that person in the casket. Lost people are dead. You can talk to them till you're blue in the face. You can talk to them. We used to have this expression. I don't know if some of you may not know what I'm talking about. But we used to say, you can talk to them till the cows come home. Did you ever hear that expression? Yes. I heard that. Oh, wow. Wow. You can talk to them until the sun is gone. And they will still be dead. And they still will not understand. Not only are they dead, they're blind. How many of you know who Gordon Mote is? Okay, my wife thinks. He is a world-class piano player. He was born blind. At about 3 or 4 years of age, they were having a family get-together, and Gordon wasn't with the rest of the people. And all of a sudden, they hear somebody on the piano just kind of plucking around a little bit. And they went in there, and there sat Gordon, about 3 or 4 years old, and he was like, and he learned to play the piano just by listening. He now plays for some of the biggest gospel groups. I've seen him on TV many times playing the piano. But he's the exception. Don't get mad at people. I heard an interview with him recently. And they asked him, they said, if you could see, what would you want to see first? And he thought, and he said, well, everybody keeps telling me my wife is beautiful. And I've seen her in the interview. She is very attractive. I would like to see what that beauty looks like. And then it's like, and this one, people keep telling me there are two different colored keys on a piano. Now, I mean, he can play. He has played professionally. He has entered into contests. He is a world-class player. He said, I would like to know what color is. Never seen color. Never seen it. But he's an exception. He's an exception. Most people that are blind well, let me read what Paul wrote. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. This is a good verse to memorize. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3 and 4. If our gospel be hid, people just cannot understand the gospel. It's hidden to them. If our gospel be hid, it is hid to them that are lost, in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. Well, why don't they understand? I'm trying to tell them about salvation. I'm trying to tell them how to be saved. Why can't they understand? Well, they're dead and they're blind. It would be like me telling one of these pews, going over to this pew right here and saying, okay, explain to me the message I just preached. How many of you think that pew is going to explain the message I'm preaching? That pew is dead. And that's the same dead, lost people are. That's why I am so opposed to this whole modern thing where, you know, it's like it's up to me to save you. If I can come up with the right story, and if I can come up with the right illustration, if I can put just enough pressure, I can save you. Unless you can raise the dead, you can't. That's why it's so important that we understand only God can save a dead sinner. Only God can open the eyes of the blind. In verse 13 and 14, Jesus goes back to spiritual things. He never loses focus. She keeps trying to jump over on something else. Let's discuss water. Let's discuss the well. Let's discuss how you're going to get water out of the well. Let's discuss the societal problems of race and half-breeds, which is what the Samaritan was. Let's change the subject. Jesus kept coming back and coming back and coming back to eternal things. In verse 15, she tries again to change the subject. Give me this water that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. She is still trying to make everything earthly. Change the subject. Let's get back to earthly things. Finally, in verse 16, Jesus goes to her sin. Now, there are some people who will tell you you should not preach against people's sin because they might get offended. I like what one preacher answered. I would rather they be offended because I gave them the gospel than to burn in hell because I didn't. Jesus said, go call your husband. Let's deal with your sin. Woman said, I'm not married. I have no husband. Jesus said, thou hast well said. You're correct. You're not married. But you're living with a guy not married. You're living with a man without ever being married to him. And besides, in verse 18, thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou now hast is not thy husband, in that saidest thou truly. Now there's several things, I don't have time, but in a very pointed way, Jesus is bringing the conversation back to deal with her sin. I'm not married. You're right. You're correct. You're not married. You're living in open sin. Oh, yeah, you told the truth. You're not married. Yeah, that was true. Because you're living in open sin, unmarried. And besides, you've had 5 husbands before living with your current man. Now, I don't have time to get into this, but it's interesting, and I've used this in messages on marriage and divorce. Notice Jesus did not say you had 1 husband and 5 live-ins. She was divorced. She married, divorced, married, divorced, married, divorced, married, divorced, married, divorced, and finally just lived with the guy. But each of those men, Jesus recognized as her husband. I'll have to come back to that another day. In verse 19, she still tries to turn the conversation. Let's discuss religion. Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and ye, the Jews, say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Let's not talk about my husbands. Let's not talk about my sin. Let's discuss religion. It's amazing how people will try to turn the conversation to something to get away from their sin. Something controversial. Well, what does your church believe about election? Folks, don't waste your time and their time trying to explain the sovereignty of God to someone who is dead and someone who is blind. All they're trying to do is get you from point A to point B to get you sidetracked. Let's discuss religion. Let's discuss, the proper church. Let's discuss the proper city of worship. Let's discuss, religion. Let's get away from my sin and let's focus on religion. Another subject that Satan uses, and I don't even know if I've got it in my notes. I'm going to read it. People will often bring up politics to get off of their sin and their need of salvation. Well, now, you seem to be religious. You're a member of Grace Baptist Church. What's wrong with LGBTQ+? Well, now, and then you forget about where you're going, salvation, and you all of a sudden now you're discussing something that will not make a hill of beans difference in their eternal destiny. Let's talk about worship. Why are you against? Oh, I almost said something. Why are you against gang members crossing our border and raping and killing our women? Don't you have compassion on them? Don't fall for it. It's a trap. It's a trick, because they would rather argue anything. They would rather talk about, the presidential candidates and what a jerk Trump is and what a airhead Harris is. And, let's talk about anything. Just don't get on my sin. Let's discuss something else. It can be religion, it can be politics. Verse 26, finally Jesus reveals himself as the true Messiah. I that speak unto thee am he. The woman is saved. She goes to town and begins telling all the men of the town, come see a man that told me all things that ever I did. And a great multitude leave the town to go out to where Jesus is. And Jesus preaches to them, and a multitude of them are saved. Jesus then goes to the city full of Samaritans, and a multitude of people are saved in the city, enough so that Jesus dwelt there for 2 days, preaching and teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because God providentially, he must go through Jerusalem. She has to hear the gospel. And you're going to get tired. And you're going to have to sit down. And while you're sitting, a woman is going to come along and you're going to present to her Jesus. Now, she's going to try to distract you. She's going to want to discuss everything in the world. But keep your focus on Jesus. Keep your focus on Christ. So what about you and I? And I've already covered some of this. Sometimes God leads us where we must go, even though we may not understand why. We need to be sensitive to the leadership of God when He changes our plans. And we end up someplace we really didn't plan to be. You know, I've been in the hospital so much that I keep telling them they should name a wing after me over at Christ Hospital. I should own a whole wing by now. But I've also learned that when you're a patient in bed and the nurse comes in, she's stuck. She has to do certain things. She has to take your blood pressure. She has to take your temperature. She has to give you your medicine. She has to do all of these things. And while she's there, they don't even use the thermometers that go under your tongue. So even when they're taking your temperature, you can still talk. Trying to think which time it was. It's one of the times I was in the hospital. And one of the aides came in, and she's doing her thing. And I began talking to her. Next time she came in, I picked up, started talking to her again. After about a day, she was taking her breaks to come in my room and ask questions. I look at that whole hospital visit. God put me there to witness to one young girl. I was thinking about her recently. I don't know if God ever saved her or not. I may not know until I get to heaven. But she took her breaks just to come to my room and ask me questions about the Bible and about salvation and the differences between what we believe and what her religion believes. You know what? Like I said, I don't know what happened after I left, but I got a chance to witness to someone that I would never have gotten a chance to witness to had I not been admitted to the hospital. Well, that's a tough way to go. What all did Jesus endure so that you and I might be saved? Spending a week in a hospital is nothing compared to what Jesus endured. Not all nurses and aides were open, but everybody knew when they left, don't go in his room. Don't get trapped into chasing rabbits that lead to nowhere. So what if you convince them the truth of the sovereignty of God? and they die and go to hell, what good have you done them? So what if you convince them of the truth of the local, independent, fundamental church? If they die and go to hell, you have not helped them at all. Don't get trapped into chasing rabbits. Don't get angry or discouraged if they don't understand. Remember, every lost person you talk to is dead, they're blind, and they cannot see unless God opens their eyes. Do you know why I believe what I believe? I'm smarter than most people. No, not at all. I believe it because God opened my eyes. Not only in salvation, but in truth that I believe. Don't get discouraged if they don't understand. Remember, you cannot save them. God called us to preach the gospel to every creature. God called us to be sowers of the seed. Paul said, I have planted, Apollos has watered, but God gave the increase. We are obligated to present the gospel every way possible. But when we have presented the gospel, only God can take that seed and explode it. It's the power of God. God only can give the harvest. You plant a garden, but once you put that seed in the ground, you cannot make that seed grow. You can plant the tomatoes, you can plant the onions, you can plant all of those things, and you won't get a garden unless you do plant them. But you cannot make that garden grow. People will never be saved unless they hear the gospel. That's our job. But you can't pressure them. I was talking to, I think it was Brother Schultz yesterday. We talked so long that he was supposed to eat dinner with Brother and Mrs. Hunt, and I made him a little bit late because we were talking and forgot all about time. But you cannot force people to be saved. All you can do is plant and water. But it's God that giveth